Have you ever had that sudden freezing realization that you are completely, totally alone in a public place? Not because the place is empty, but because whatever is standing right next to you isn't human, and nobody else can see it. I used to think my mind was playing tricks on me when I got tired. I used to laugh off those little late-night visual glitches. But after what happened on the midnight transit line out of Boston last November, I don't look at crowds the same way anymore. And I definitely don't look into the dark reflection of windows. If you think a crowded train car is the safest place to be at midnight, you're dead wrong. My brother-in-law, Dave, and I had been planning this trip for a year. We finally managed to snag tickets to the Eastern Conference Finals. It was an absolute blowout game. The stadium was completely electric, 40,000 people screaming, beer flying everywhere, the kind of high-energy chaos that leaves your ears ringing and your chest buzzing for hours after the final buzzer. By the time we poured out of the arena, it was past 11:30. The streets were a sea of team jerseys, car horns, and chanting fans. Dave and I were exhausted but riding this massive adrenaline high. We didn't want to pay $80 for a ride share, so we sprinted through the freezing rain to catch the last commuter train heading out to the suburbs. When we boarded car 4, it was packed. People were crammed shoulder to shoulder, singing team songs, checking their phones, laughing. Dave and I managed to snag 2 seats right in the middle of the car, facing each other with a small laminate table between us. Dave instantly leaned his head back against the window, his eyes glazed over from a combination of 3 stadium drafts and pure exhaustion. I was still too wired to sleep. I sat there watching the regular cast of late-night commuters. To my left, a girl was typing furiously on her laptop. Across the aisle, a group of guys were re-watching game highlights on a phone. Everything was completely, undeniably normal. Until we hit the first long tunnel outside the city limits. The overhead fluorescent lights in the train did that quick, standard flicker they always do when the power switches grids. The car dimmed for maybe 2 seconds, leaving us in the dark before buzzing back to life. That's when I noticed the guy sitting 4 rows up, on the right side of the aisle. He hadn't been there when we boarded. I was certain of it, because he was wearing a bright red vintage rain poncho, completely out of place among a sea of dark blue and green team jerseys. But it wasn't his clothes that made my chest tighten. It was the way he was sitting. He was turned completely sideways in his seat, his back pressed against the emergency exit door, facing down the aisle. Facing directly at me. While every other person in that car was slouched over or looking at a screen, this man was completely rigid. His spine was perfectly straight, and his eyes were locked onto mine with a wide, unblinking intensity. I felt that sudden sharp spike of heat in my face, the immediate discomfort of unwanted eye contact. I forced myself to look down at my phone, scrolling through social media to prove to myself I didn't care. I told myself he was probably just a drunk fan or someone suffering a mental health episode. It's a late-night train. Weird things happen. But a minute passed, and the back of my neck felt like it was burning. I sneaked a glance back up. He hadn't moved a millimeter. He was still staring. But now that my eyes adjusted to the lighting, I felt a pit drop into my stomach. His face looked wrong. It wasn't just a regular expression. His eyes were wide open, so wide that I could see the white all the way around his irises. And his mouth was clamped shut into this incredibly tight straight line. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck were straining like taut cables. He looked like he was throwing his entire physical effort into staring at me. I reached across the table and kicked Dave's foot. "Hey, Dave. Wake up a second." Dave groaned, blinking heavily, adjusting his baseball cap. "What? Are we at our stop?" "No," I whispered, leaning forward so only he could hear. "Look 4 rows ahead on the right. The guy in the red poncho. What is his deal? He's been staring at me since the tunnel." Dave shifted in his seat, squinting down the aisle for a good 5 seconds. He let out a dry chuckle and rubbed his eyes. "Dude, there's nobody in a red poncho down there. That's a middle-aged lady reading a book." I snapped my gaze back to the seat. My heart did a violent thud against my ribs. Dave was right. The seat where the man had been sitting was now occupied by a woman in a gray coat, completely absorbed in her Kindle. The man in the red poncho was gone. "Must have moved to the next car," Dave muttered, already closing his eyes again. "Stop being paranoid. You've had too much caffeine." I sat back, my hands trembling slightly. I tried to convince myself Dave was right. Maybe the guy stood up and walked into car 5 while I was looking at my phone, and the woman had just shifted over. It made logical sense. It was the only thing that made sense. Then, the train entered the second tunnel. This tunnel was longer, cutting deep through the rock beneath the hills. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then completely died for a full 5 seconds. The car plunged into total blackness, save for the faint blue glow of a few passenger phones. When the lights buzzed back on with a harsh hum, a wave of cold sweat broke across my forehead. He was closer. He was now sitting just 2 rows ahead of me, in an aisle seat. He hadn't just moved. He was in the exact same rigid posture, turned completely sideways, his chest angled directly at my face. Now that he was only a few feet away, the details of his face made my breath catch in my throat. His skin had this sickening bloodless gray tint, like old wax. And those wide, unblinking eyes weren't looking at my face, they were locked onto my throat. His mouth was still clamped in that impossible tight line, but his chest was moving up and down in these incredibly short, violent jerks. He was panting. But it was completely silent. I looked around the car in absolute panic. The girl with the laptop was still typing. The guys across the aisle were laughing at another video. Nobody was looking at him. He was occupying a seat right next to an elderly man, practically leaning into the poor guy's shoulder space. But the old man didn't even flinch or shift away. It was like the space he was occupying was completely empty to everyone else. "Dave," I croaked, my voice cracking. "Dave," he moved. "He's right there. Look at him, Dave, please." Dave didn't open his eyes this time. "Let me sleep, man. It's a long ride." "Dave, look at him." I practically yelled, grabbing his wrist and squeezing. Dave snapped his eyes open, visibly annoyed. He looked directly at the seat 2 rows ahead. "Jason, seriously, stop. There is nobody there. The seat is literally empty. The old guy is sitting alone. If you're trying to freak me out, it's not funny." My blood turned to pure ice. I looked at Dave, then back at the man in the poncho. The moment Dave said those words, the man's tight, clenched mouth slowly began to open. His lips parted with a wet, peeling sound. He didn't have teeth, just raw, dark, inflamed gums. And out from between those gums, he began to push his tongue. It just kept coming. It was impossibly long gray-black, and split at the end like a reptile's, curling upwards toward his nose. He let out a tiny high-pitched whistling sound through his nose, a sound so sharp it pierced right through the ambient rumble of the train track. He lifted a single gray, dirt-caked finger and pointed it directly at my eyes. I couldn't breathe. The air in the train car felt thick, like hot oil. I wanted to stand up and run to another car, but my legs felt entirely paralyzed, heavy as lead. I could hear the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the tracks speeding up. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, muffled and distorted. "Next stop. Oak Ridge Station. 5 minutes. 5 minutes." We just had to survive 5 minutes. But I knew what lay between us and Oak Ridge Station. It was the final, 3-mile quarry tunnel. The darkest one on the line. "We need to get off," I choked out, pulling at Dave's jacket. "Dave, we need to move to the next car right now. Please." Dave saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in my face, and his annoyance finally turned to genuine concern. "Whoa, Jason, hey. You're white as a sheet, man. Are you having a panic attack?" "Just come with me," I pleaded, standing up, my knees shaking violently. As soon as my feet hit the floor, the train slammed into the final tunnel. The lights didn't just flicker this time. They blew out with a loud metallic pop. Total, crushing, absolute darkness enveloped the car. The ambient chatter of the passengers instantly died out, replaced by a sudden heavy silence that felt entirely unnatural. In the dark, I could hear it. Right in front of my face. It wasn't the sound of the train anymore. It was the sound of a wet, heavy tongue slapping against bare skin, accompanied by that soft, steady, rapid panting. Like an animal trapped in a tight box. I reached out blindly in the dark, screaming for Dave, my hands flailing wildly. My fingers touched something, not Dave's denim jacket, but a fabric that felt freezing cold, damp, and stiff. Like a plastic rain poncho. A hand, unbelievably cold, with skin that felt like rough sandpaper, wrapped around my throat. It squeezed with an impossible, crushing force. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. I felt my knees give out, my vision spinning into a darker shade of black as I suffocated. In the dark, that sharp, high-pitched whistling sound vibrated right against my eardrum. It was laughing at me. With the very last ounce of strength I had, I swung my right arm blindly forward. My fist connected with something hard and cold. It felt like hitting a block of solid ice, and I heard a wet, guttural screech. The grip on my throat instantly vanished. A split second later, the train burst out of the tunnel and into the bright, stark lights of Oak Ridge Station. I collapsed onto the floor of the aisle, gasping for air, clutching my neck. The lights overhead were fully functional again. The train car erupted into chaos, but not because of a monster. Because of me. Dave was on his knees, holding my shoulders, shouting for someone to call 911. The girl with the laptop was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The seat 2 rows ahead was completely empty. The old man was gone. The woman was gone. To everyone else in that car, I was just a lunatic who had stood up in the dark, screamed, and choked himself into a violent seizure. They took me to the hospital. The doctors checked my vitals, ran a toxicology screen, and chalked it up to an acute panic episode brought on by exhaustion and alcohol. Dave still looks at me weirdly whenever I bring it up. He thinks I had a nervous breakdown. I tried to believe them. I really did. I spent months telling myself it was a waking nightmare. Until last weekend. I was cleaning out the jacket I wore that night, the one I hadn't touched since November. I reached into the deep side pocket, expecting to find my old transit ticket stub. My fingers brushed against something else. Something small, hard, and smooth. I pulled it out. It was a human tooth. A perfectly healthy molar, completely clean, with no root attached. And stained around the edges of the enamel was a tiny dried smear of bright red plastic. I don't take the train anymore. But sometimes when I'm driving home late at night and I pass under a dark underpass, I look up at my rearview mirror, and I swear I can hear a soft, wet whistle coming from the back seat.